Thank you, Deputy Minister Osso. We appreciate those very insightful remarks, and we appreciate all your support with respect to our debt transparency principles that we hope the G20 will support this coming weekend. So thank you very much, and good luck over the next few days. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all here to our G20, and which is also our spring membership meeting this year, which is unusual for us. We've combined the two. Every year we host a session wherever the G20 is being located, and this year obviously the Japanese are hosting, and they've done a magnificent job. They've been incredibly easy to work with. So thank you to our Japanese partners for really making this a wonderful experience. It's good to be back here in Japan and Tokyo. I've spent most of my professional life coming here, and I always enjoy coming back. Let me also thank our sponsors, which will be arrayed at the very top here. You'll see them throughout, and I will, at the end, run through them for all of you to hear. I also want to thank our board members. There are a number of you here today, far too many to single out, but we'll have most of you on the stage starting this morning and running for the next couple of days. I will note Axel Weber, who's my chairman, also the chairman of UBS, is here, and I want to say thanks to him for all of his support. And he will be here joining us on the stage in just a few minutes. And then to thank all of our Japanese member firms. They are incredibly good hosts. They're great members of the IIF. And again, I will thank them throughout the day, but they have been fabulous to me, not only for this particular session here in Tokyo, but throughout my tenure at the IIF. And to thank all of our member firms that are here today. I work for you. We work for you. We're here because of you, and we couldn't be here if it was not for you. So at any time over the next 2 days, there's something that any of you need, please don't hesitate to pull me or any of my colleagues aside and give us feedback. I like market signals. I like to know what we're doing right, but what we're doing wrong and what we can improve. So before we get to the first panel, let me just share a few thoughts with you on some things that I think are important. Before I do, let me just also recognize that Japan has gone through a great transformation over the past month or so. We have a new emperor. We have the Reiwa era in Japan, which means beautiful harmony. Emperor Naruhito is now ascended to the chrysanthemum throne. That's a huge change here in Japan. And Reiwa is founded as part of a poem that was penned more than 1,200 years ago by a Japanese statesman who wrote about an early spring day and the opening of the plum blossoms. Today, Reiwa represents a culture being born and nurtured by people coming together beautifully. And so hopefully the G20 this weekend will come together beautifully as well. We'll see. But usually when central bankers and finance ministers come together, there's lots of interesting discussions. There will be this weekend as well. But the concept is coming together beautifully, not only for this weekend, but for this important new era in Japan. It's also an exciting time because the Rugby World Cup will be here next month, and I know some of you, Douglas Flint is here, are huge rugby fans, and those of you who are huge rugby fans, I'm sure will look forward to coming back and being a part of that. But first, a couple of points. Some key points, actually, that I think are often cited but are worthy of restating. And one is the importance of trade. Minister also earlier this week, as I noted when I opened this morning, I talked about the importance of multilateralism. It's multilateralism in trade which has been transformative not only for the global economy of Japan, Asia, for all of us. In my lifetime, we have seen a remarkable increase in human longevity. The number of statistics are mind-numbing in which the way in which the human condition has improved. Extreme poverty has dropped from about 50% of the population to less than 10%. Billions have been lifted out of poverty. Hundreds of millions have been lifted into the global middle class. And much of that is a result of trade. David Ricardo taught us over 200 years ago the gains from trade. And sometimes we forget what David Ricardo taught us. But there's no doubt about it that trade and exchange leads to higher and better outcomes and greater prosperity. That doesn't mean it's always perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't challenges or differences. That doesn't mean everyone plays by the same rules at the same time. That's why we have important multilateral institutions. But we must remain committed to the post-war multilateral institutions, which have truly been transformative in terms of improving the human condition. And you just think about some of the statistics here. Bilateral trade between the U.S. and Japan today is almost $300 billion. Japanese FDI in the U.S. has increased by 100% in the past decade to almost $500 billion. Japan is the third largest global investor in the U.S. after the U.K. and Canada. And Japan ranks second in the U.S. in terms of manufacturing jobs. I'm originally from the state of Kentucky in the United States, and there's a huge Toyota facility in Georgetown, Kentucky, and I did a little work there when I was in graduate school. They employ 6,000 individuals, Kentuckians, and there's another 2,000 in satellite factories around. Huge employer in the state, one of the best employers in the state. Foreign direct investment creates jobs, and in the United States, it's created wonderful jobs, number of jobs. You have a Honda facility in Ohio, a Toyota truck facility in Texas, and the list goes on and on. But there's no doubt that the trade issues are becoming more pronounced, and we're seeing it show up in the statistics globally. The headline of the FT today was a forecast from the IMF, and it's a similar forecast we see from the OECD and other institutions about how current trade tensions would have a deleterious effect on global growth. And we've seen it already. Global FDI fell by nearly a fifth over the past year. From the previous year, it's an estimated 1.2 trillion. This drop in FDI is the third drop in as many years, bringing FDI flows back to the low point reached right after the global financial crisis. And the WTO, as well as the OECD, notes that world trade will continue to face strong headwinds into 2019 and 2020, and could potentially be a precipitating event with respect to slower growth. And while trade volumes remain fairly sustained, some downturn will continue to occur. And I hear it from every one of our IF members. I've probably seen over 100 financial leaders since January, and just in this past week, I've probably been with 50 CEOs and chairmen of the largest financial institutions in the world. And it's the number one issue we talk about when we don't talk about regulation and other aspects of greening the financial system and what it means to run an institution in a technology-dominant era. The trade tensions are really what's dominating boardroom conversation. So we hope that cooler heads prevail over this coming weekend, and when the heads of state meet back here in Japan at the end of the month. We hope that trade tensions don't spill over into even more deleterious impact on growth or trade or investment. And we hope that those who assemble will remember those elements, those critical elements, which have created such global prosperity in the post-war era. The second topic is debt transparency. The global debt burden now stands at almost 320% of GDP. It's increased 70 trillion, that's with a 7 trillion in this cycle. And the total global debt now stands at 243 trillion. The figures are especially concerning in emerging low-income countries. Emerging markets are now at 212% of GDP, up 146% since the crisis. And EM government debt has reached a record high of 50% of GDP. In search of ways to support debt sustainability in the direction, our board of directors, under the leadership of Axel Weber, has spent the last 18 months assembling a set of principles with respect to debt transparency, private sector flows, and to low-income sovereign borrowers. And I'm pleased to say that these principles that we've assembled have received high praise from the IMF and the World Bank and other global institutions. And we hope that, as I mentioned earlier with Vice Minister also, that the G20 will give us an official endorsement this coming weekend. We also see this principle as a first step in what will prove to be a living document. It's not as expansive as what we would like. It's not as deep as what we would like, but it was the clearing price for what was doable. And so it's the beginning of a long process where we hope that we can provide greater transparency and therefore more efficient markets and more efficient pricing of debt and ensure that we don't find ourselves back into another debt crisis. And I appreciate my board's leadership on this issue. The third issue is one of environmental sustainability. The past year, the one phrase I've heard more than anything else is ESG, or green finance, or environmental sustainability has been the topic of every conversation we've had. I would say a year ago at the IF, we did very little on the green finance agenda, and it's about to swallow us up. I see my staff over there acknowledge I can't hire enough people to keep us on top of the various issues with respect to ensuring environmental sustainability and the important role the financial sector will play in ensure that happens. Mark Carney, who you'll see later today in discussion on stage, who's been one of the world leaders with respect to focusing the sector on the importance of climate change generally and the role that the financial sector, banks, insurance companies, asset managers, all financial intermediaries, the role that we'll play to ensure environmental sustainability and that we can usher in a greener economy. Consumers, too, are driving activity. Sustainable funds in the U.S. attracted a record net flows last year, not to mention the green bond market, which after record levels of issuance in Q4 of last year is now over $430 billion. And countries like China, France, and Germany are the biggest issuers, accounting for over 40% of the market. Institutional investors are considering ESG performance in terms of the companies they invest in and the assets they buy. And the key really in some of the interesting topics we're focused on is the definition of green. There is no common taxonomy. Green can mean anything. You can have a green product in one country and a different green product in another country, and they're not necessarily the same. We think it's important to come up with a common taxonomy that green means green. We all know what it is we're talking about. And again, I want to applaud my board for showing real leadership in this issue, and I think it will be one of the most dynamic topics that we take on over the coming years. The fourth issue is regulatory fragmentation. Minister also mentioned the FSB and IOSCO's report that just came out last night, looking at the importance of avoiding regulatory fragmentation. The ring fencing that is occurring in many jurisdictions and within many jurisdictions that trap capital and liquidity and create a much more brittle global financial system. Brittle in the sense that it's more difficult to move capital from one location to another and therefore do what we do, which is intermediate savings to its highest return. And so I want to commend the FSB and the Japanese government for their real intellectual leadership on the importance of avoiding regulatory fragmentation. It's an issue which we'll be discussing here on the stage later today, and one which will be an FSB priority throughout 2019 and 2020. Vice Chair of the Fed, Randy Quarles, is currently the chair of the FSB and has told me that he considers this one of their top priorities going forward. The fifth and final issue is data. Rarely do we have a board meeting or board discussion that the issue of data doesn't come up in some form or fashion. Data privacy, data localization, data rights, data ownership, who owns it, who manipulates it, who enriches it, where it goes, the issue of open banking, whether it's PSD2 in Europe and potentially PSD3. Data is the lifeblood of almost every industry, and we consider ourselves not only in the financial service industry, but we are a technology industry as well. For example, McKinsey projects that data-fueled applications for AI, when we do a lot of work on AI, will generate $13 trillion in new global economic activity by 2030. And the volume of data continues to increase enormously. We expect to see a 530% increase in cross-border data flows. That's 100 to 175 zettabytes. A zettabyte is 10 to the 21st power of bytes. That's 21 zeros, the equivalent of streaming the entire Netflix catalog 5 million times. Multiply that by 175. So the amount of data that's crossing borders or within borders is enormous. And at a time when we talk about deglobalization, and we may be measuring globalization in terms of container vessels and hard commodities, what we're really seeing is an increase in globalization in terms of cross-border data flows. As Prime Minister Abe himself said back at Davos in January, he called for bytes without borders in an effort to unleash the benefits of data by allowing it to cross borders freely, safely, and do so in a way that protects individual personal rights. But there's a huge tension between data privacy and the need to share data. And we also see it with respect to the interdiction of illicit financial flows. In order to stop or achieve our goals in anti-money laundering, for example, or terrorist finance, or proliferation finance, or sanctions finance, we need to ensure information sharing. But it's difficult to share information across borders when we see an increase in provisions or prohibitions against sharing that data. So data is an important part of what we do at the IF. It will continue to be an important part of what we do in the future. So in conclusion, let me just say we've got a great program here starting this morning, running for the next 2 days. Many distinguished speakers, and I hope that you find it useful. Again, I like market signals. If you have suggestions on how we can do it better, please don't hesitate. And let me just again thank our lead sponsors and all of our sponsors actually. MUFG, Mizuho, SMBC, as well as Nomura, Norchukken, Aflac, IOSD, our good friends from Silicon Valley, Fitch Ratings, Prudential, and Visa. Thank you very much for your generous support for the next 2 days. And I also want to thank the Japanese government for their cooperation, and in particular the JFSA and the Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank. They've been great partners in helping us assemble this program, and we couldn't have done it without them. So with that, thank you very much for being here today. We greatly appreciate your participation, and we hope that you find this program useful to you. Thank you.